So next up, a little change to the program. We will have a lecture from Karl Erik Lund. He's currently a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, and he's been involved in tobacco regulation for the last 40 years. He is also associate editor for the journal Nicotine Tobacco Research, and has recently served as an expert witness in litigations against the tobacco industry. Here today to ask, how do we continue to reduce harms related to tobacco? Please welcome Karl Erik Lund.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks for the introduction, Dominic. And also, thanks for expanding the scope of your conference to include tobacco policy, which has been the focus of my research for the past 37 years. For this entire period, I've been funded by the state, so I have no ties to any nicotine-producing industry. But as Dominic said, I've served as an expert witness in several court cases against the tobacco industry, so I'm not your best friend. Globally, there are now 1.2 billion smokers, most living in low-income countries. We have a stable cigarette consumption, resulting in approximately 7 million annual deaths, most occurring in the working class brackets of society. And in Europe alone, there are still 20% smokers, and Greece and Bulgaria at the very top, with approximately 40% smokers. And Sweden and Norway, where users more often consume their tobacco as snus, is placed at the very bottom. Denmark, Iceland, and Finland a bit higher. Now, the total number of smokers in the 5 Nordic countries adds up to approximately 2.5 million, according to this publication. And each year, approximately 30,000 persons die from smoking-related diseases. So even after 50 years of systematic tobacco control, the Nordic countries still have many smokers, and the death toll continue to be high. But there are no lack of governmental strategy plans that aims to eradicate smoking, and I have done the rather perverse thing to actually read these plans. And I can tell you that it's quite repetitive exercise, because they're pretty identical, telling us that zero vision for smoking will be achieved mainly through intensified use of the traditional punitive means of tobacco control, meaning stronger regulations, tax hikes, and increased denormalization of smokers, accompanied by educational means, meaning increased information, more terrifying health warnings, and intensified media campaigns. But the fact is that according to this official ranking of the infrastructure for tobacco control, the tobacco policy in most Nordic countries are already placed among the most restrictive nations. So, intensifying the traditional tobacco control measures even further into a modern society that already has been the recipient of these measures for decades might only produce a marginal returns. So what I mean is that stronger regulations on smoking will now be implemented into societies that's already fairly well regulated. Tax hikes will be imposed on products that already appear costly to smokers who are overrepresented by persons with low income. And further denormalization will be imposed on a group that is already feeling stigmatized. Smokers already feel bad about themselves. And intensified media campaigns will be shown to an audience already trained in dealing with unwanted information. They are kind of immune. So more information will be provided into populations that are already very well informed that smoking is bad. In fact, smokers even overestimate their own risks, so there is no information deficit. So there might be marginal returns from intensifying the traditional means of tobacco control. And moreover, we must also acknowledge that the smokers at the receiving end have changed. Compared to smokers we addressed some decades ago, the remaining smokers have become more resistant and reactant, inoculated and immune against further attacks on their behavior. And as a group, smokers have gone through a social class descent and have become overrepresented with persons from vulnerable groups, many with mental disorders, and thereby lack coping skills in, for example, smoking cessation. You know, smokers doesn't look like this anymore. Back when smoking was associated with style and high social class, they're no longer scientists, educators smoking Kent with a micronite filter, which, by the way, was put on the market with filter partly made up of asbestos. So smokers are no longer doctors, dentists, or nurses who recommend the cigarettes in the ads. Smokers are no longer athletes in Tour de France, sharing a cigarette during the race. Well, smokers nowadays look more like this. I could have shown you tons of statistics illustrating the class descent of smoker, but this slide really tells it all. I'm sorry if I offend someone here. I noted a lot of smokers outside when I arrived here, so I apologize to you. Anyway, society has changed and smokers have changed, but the tobacco control policy, as expressed in these strategy plans, remains more or less the same. So this realization, this acknowledgement, in a way, is a point of departure for proponents of a supplementary, pragmatic strategy to fight smoking-related diseases called tobacco harm reduction. Now here, the basic idea is that at the same time that we make smoking more difficult for smokers, we facilitate transition to less harmful nicotine use and not necessarily pursue an abstinence-only policy for nicotine use. We provide smokers with an escape route. So the four core principles of tobacco harm reduction is to make alternatives to cigarettes available, accessible, affordable, and attractive to smokers. Implement risk proportionate regulation and taxation that will provide smokers with an incentive to switch if they're unable or unwilling to quit nicotine altogether. And actively inform smokers about the risk difference as compared to cigarettes. And finally, also advise and assist smokers to make a product switch. Now, authorities in several countries have fully embraced these four core principles of tobacco harm reduction, like in England, where the National Health Service offers free e-cigarettes to smokers to quit. These posters are from the recent Swap to Stop campaign in the UK. They recommend a switch to e-cigarettes. But there are, in fact, a lot of other low-risk alternatives available to smokers these days. Now, some products are tobacco-based, others are purely nicotine-based without any tobacco. Some are inhalation products, while others are consumed orally. So let's have a look at these. I mentioned e-cigarettes. They've been available in different shapes and sizes for approximately 10 years now. Most products have in fact been manufactured outside the tobacco industry, but in recent years, e-cigarettes have also been integrated into the portfolio of the tobacco industry, which automatically made e-cigarettes dubious, of course. Now, e-cigarettes contain no tobacco, but the nicotine is a derivative from the tobacco plant. But it's something called heated tobacco products that have sailed up as the tobacco industry's major investment area. Now, unlike e-cigarettes, these products contain tobacco, but you don't set fire to the tobacco like in traditional cigarettes. In this device, you only heat the tobacco with help from a battery technology. So it's no combustion, no burning, which is the process that makes tobacco really toxic. Tobacco-free nicotine pouches have recently become popular in parts of Europe, including the Nordic countries and also in the US. Here you have placed small tea bags containing plant fibers, flavors, and nicotine under your lip, and eventually nicotine will pass through the mucous membrane and into the blood circulation. So nicotine products are available in most countries in the EU. Unlike snus, which is a smokeless tobacco product widely used in Scandinavia. But for reasons difficult to understand, at least for me, snus is banned in the EU, including Denmark and Finland. Though Sweden was granted an exemption from this ban when they entered the EU in 1995, I think. So in a favorable regulatory regime, these 4 non-combustible nicotine products might have the ability to compete with and even outperform the more hazardous cigarettes. Because there is a huge risk difference from inhaling smoke from combustible cigarettes as compared to the various non-combustible nicotine products. It is during combustion, during the burning, that the tobacco becomes extremely toxic and creating more than 7,000 emissions, and approximately 7 of those are potentially carcinogenic. So when compared to cigarettes, expert groups assess these non-combustible products to make up a minor risk, basing their assessment on toxicological analysis. For example, the British health authorities have repeatedly stated that vaping e-cigarettes only makes up about 5% of the risk from smoking. But this estimate is, of course, disputed by opponents of tobacco harm reduction. Anyway, with a range of novel, low-risk recreational products available, the 100-year dominance of cigarettes might be disrupted, and an imaginary future nicotine market will look more fragmented and diversified like this. So my guess is that cigarettes will not disappear entirely, but become a niche product on the nicotine market, like vinyl records in the current music market. But to get there will depend upon the supply side, the product development, the consumers' likability for novel nicotine products, flavors being a crucial element, and not least how we, on the health side, the regulators, decide to regulate the availability and accessibility and attractiveness of these products, and how we will communicate the risks as compared to cigarettes. So we can have a look at the situation in the Nordic countries. In all 5 Nordic countries, cigarettes are very accessible, can be bought 24/7 from every street corner, although with very strong market restrictions. Now, if you say that the risk potential from cigarettes are set to 100%, like this, expert groups address that, for example, nicotine pouches will have a risk potential of only 1 to 3% as compared to cigarettes. That's in the same ballpark as pharmaceutical products like nicotine gum or nicotine patches. But in spite of this huge risk difference, we have made these tobacco-free pouches subjected to the same regulations as cigarettes, more or less. In Finland, they plan to reduce their attractiveness by restricting flavors, the most important feature that smokers like when they switch. And in the Kingdom of Norway, these products have been banned unless, and here comes the great paradox of tobacco regulation, unless manufacturers add tiny amounts of tobacco to the products, then it's characterized as snus and can be sold legally. So you make a product more hazardous in order to get market access. That's brilliant. Now this is the situation for snus, assumed to, by experts, make up about 2 to maximum 10% of the risk as compared to smoking. It's banned in Finland, it's banned in Denmark, and attempts to ban flavor in snus have recently failed in Iceland and Norway, but this fight is not yet over. Snus is taxed less heavily than cigarettes, so it's more affordable in these countries. And in Sweden, the current government plan to reduce the tax on snus even further in parallel with a tax increase on cigarettes. So in Sweden have adopted tobacco harm reduction friendly policy for snus at the moment. So what about the regulation of e-cigarettes, assumed by experts to make up 5 to maximum 20% of the risk as compared to smoking? EU regulations have forced Finland and Denmark reluctantly to put this product on the market, but they have decided to ban or restrict flavors and mimic the cigarette regulations also for e-cigarettes. E-cigarettes are still banned in Norway, even though the parliament voted to lift this ban 7 years ago. Still, it's not implemented. Don't ask me why. And again, Sweden stands out with more liberal policy. And finally, heated tobacco products assumed to have somewhere between 15 or 35% of the risk potential as compared to traditional cigarettes. Banned in Norway, not on the market in Finland, but accessible in other countries where it's regulated like cigarettes. So overall, I think we can sum it up like this. The core principles of tobacco harm reduction are totally absent in Finland and Denmark. Norway and Iceland, some products are subjected to milder regulations, other products to more severe restrictions than cigarettes. While in Sweden, the overall impression is that non-combustible nicotine products are granted favorable market terms. And health authorities in all countries have been very reluctant to inform about the risk difference in a systematic way and do not offer any advice to smokers how to make a product switch. So this is the sorry state of tobacco harm reduction in most Nordic countries, I'm afraid. But even so, some combustible nicotine products are available in some countries, as we've seen. But that's not as a consequence of a deliberate tobacco harm reduction policy. The products are available more as a consequence of tradition, like snus in Norway and Sweden, EU regulation, like e-cigarettes in Finland and Denmark, some pressure from consumers, pressure also from some policymakers arguing against paternalism and micromanagement, and also some would claim due to tobacco industry intervention. I think it is evident as of now that the regulation within the Nordic countries appear mutually inconsistent, contradictory, divergent, and a bit messy. Products that are allowed in some countries are banned in others. And moreover, my impression is that the justifications for the policy appear unbalanced, rooted in ideology, and they are emotional more than science-based. Typical claims justifying the anti-tobacco harm reduction policy in the Nordic countries can be summed up like this, I think. Firstly, a singular focus on the concern for the youth. Products are banned because this will prevent a new epidemic of teenage addiction and hinder the gateway effect, claiming that users will subsequently start smoking, although there is no evidence for that. Secondly, justifications. They claim that benefits of smokers are unknown, that there is no proven effects in smoking cessation, and that novel products will result in additional use and dual use of nicotine on top of cigarettes. There is also no evidence for that either. And thirdly, they claim that long-term health effects are currently unknown and put forward far-fetched allegation that nicotine has the potential to damage the adolescent brain. This is also heavily disputed among scientists. And fourth, they stick to the nicotine-free ideology, saying that addiction, even to less hazardous products, is a problem in itself, and that tobacco harm reduction will reverse years of progress made toward ending nicotine addiction. And they call upon the precautionary principle to justify bans on reduced risk products. And fifth, they use emotional overtones, a guilt by association, claiming that tobacco harm reduction is just another ploy from the big bad enemy of public health, the tobacco industry. So such justification, based on unscientific heuristics, totally false allegations, will force any health minister to go to war towards nicotine and tobacco harm reduction. Like in Norway, where the health minister, based on these justifications, called for immediate action against snus, e-cigarettes, and nicotine pouches in face of uncertainty, and called upon political support for the ban on flavors. In Finland, now look at the tweet in the right here. In Finland, the chair of a working group to develop nicotine policy in Finland even went so far as saying that it is important to prevent smokers from switching to snus. Could you believe that? If they're better off to continue smoking. On the left there is the contrary conclusion from a Finnish empirical study stating that snus ban has been counterproductive and in fact slowed down smoking cessation in Finland. Which leads me to finalize this talk this afternoon by sharing with you some of the experiences that we have had with snus in Norway and Sweden. Now, unlike the situation for more novel nicotine products, the snus market is mature. The usage pattern is established and have been monitored for decades, and risk estimates are epidemiologically verified, which put Norway and Sweden in a unique position to assess the net public health effect from letting an alternative, non-combustible nicotine product compete with cigarettes on the nicotine market. Now, this is how the nicotine market has changed in Norway over the last 110 years. Each period has a different tobacco product as a market leader. Plug tobacco at the start of the 20th century, followed by pipe smoking after the Second World War, and then a period of rolling tobacco, replaced by a period of manufactured cigarettes. But now, snus has disrupted 100 years of dominance of combustible tobacco products. And to make a long story short, the market share of snus increased from 7% at the turn of the century to exceed the 50% mark last year. So today, more than half of the tobacco in Norway is consumed without combustion and inhaling smoke. And furthermore, during these 22 years, the overall consumption of tobacco was reduced with more than 30%. So apparently snus entered into the market on behalf of cigarettes, not in addition to. And one reason for that is that snus has been the most popular method to quit smoking during the last decades. This slide shows methods used at the latest quit attempt by successful quitters. Snus is the green line here, coming up on top, followed by e-cigarettes, the red line. So in fact, last year, 45% of those who had successfully quit smoking within the last 10 years reported that snus was used at their final quit attempt. And also worth noting, snus seemed to attract a segment of smokers that, for some reason, do not want to use the approved pharmaceutical nicotine products, as reported in these papers below. Several studies show that a large segment of snus users are made up of former smokers. They show that the quit ratio for smoking is higher among additional snus users than among smokers only, and that snus is associated with equal or higher quit smoking ratios than medical nicotine. So all in all, snus appeal to a lot of smokers wanting to quit, and its ability to help smokers quit cigarettes seems to be fair. So when the reach component is high and the effect is fairly good, the effectiveness of snus in smoking cessation on the population level is impressive. Now, another mechanism that's been driving the market change from cigarettes to snus could be diversion. Tobacco-prone youth picking up snus instead of cigarettes. Now, ecological trend data support the diversion hypothesis. Here you see inverse correlation between daily smoking and daily snus use in the age group 16 to 29 years. So the shift occurred first among males and some years later among females. So during the last decades, snus has totally displaced cigarettes among young adults. And if there is such a thing as a gateway, we can't really find any sign of that at the population level, where the increase in snus use occurred in parallel with the decrease in smoking. So any potential gateway effect on the individual level must have been dwarfed by a much large number moving away from smoking. So what would have been the decline in smoking among youth without availability to snus? Well, we don't know exactly. Well, in other countries in the EU zone where snus is banned, also experience a decline in smoking, although not so fast as in Norway, Sweden, and Iceland, where snus is allowed. Let's have a brief look at the health effects. I can't go into detail here, but with cigarettes, approximately 7% of the smoking-related diseases are caused by lung cancer, respiratory diseases, and cardiovascular diseases. However, snus has not been associated or only weakly associated with these three diseases that make up 70% of the death toll from smoking. So consequently, when the nicotine market shifts from cigarettes or snus, like it has in Sweden, where men consume the same volume of tobacco as men in the EU, but mostly in the form of snus, and have done so for quite some time. The level of smoking-related diseases like lung cancer, heart disease, stroke, and respiratory diseases are less than half as compared with men in the EU who consume the same volume of tobacco, but they set fire to tobacco and inhale the smoke. So, in a public health calculus that take into account the excess risk of snus as compared to non-use, the reduced risk as compared to smoking, and the patterns of use, average smokers relative to never smokers, as has been done in these papers you can see here, you have to conclude that the availability to snus has in fact produced a net gain to public health, because the combined numbers who have quit smoking for snus, reduced smoking intensity by snus, and picked up snus instead of cigarettes have outnumbered snus users who otherwise would have been tobacco-free. So, health gains from smoking cessation, smoking reduction, and smoking substitution produced by snus has more than outweighed the marginal health loss in the fraction of never smokers taking up snus. But of course, the purists within tobacco control, those aiming for a totally nicotine-free society, they don't want to realize this because it doesn't fit their narrative for a nicotine-free society. Their initial goal to curb smoking has, in some point of time, morphed into a fight against the drug nicotine, which is something completely different. Well, I started out by saying that I have spent 37 years in tobacco research, and the only goal for the tobacco policy when I started my career was to fight smoking-related diseases, not to fight nicotine. And I still stick to that today, and are willing to use pragmatic solutions to achieve it. So after 37 years in tobacco control, my impression is that for purists in the tobacco control community, it has been difficult to accept that snus may have had greater impact on declining smoking than the regulations they have spent a lifetime fighting for. So thank you for your patience, thank you for your invitation, and thank you for your attention.